So now let's talk about a way in which science and physics can actually really help Indigenous communities, which is the provision of power to really remote areas. Now many Indigenous people feel they need to live on country, on their ancestral lands. The lands of such spiritual significance that they can't just move to a city or something like that because that's severed their link to their homeland. So it's really important for them to live on these remote areas. But these areas are very remote and they are very few jobs. The people living here are often caught between two cultures. They have often in these remote areas in Australia they have their very strong Indigenous culture and languages, but they've also got to interact with the Western world of money and electricity bills and legal systems and so on. Now, most of these really remote areas are not connected to an electricity grid. It would just be far too expensive to run transmission lines across hundreds or thousands of kilometres of desert to supply them with power, given that often they're very small communities with only 100 people or less, up to maybe 1,000 for a few of the largest ones. Because they're so remote, they generally get their power from diesel generators. So what happens is they get a diesel generator and a tanker with fuel will arrive every now and then, fill up the fuel tanks, and then they will run the generator to get the power. Now this is a very expensive way to get power, so the electricity in these remote areas is far more expensive than electricity in the cities. Now the way that people normally pay for the electricity in these remote communities by going to a local shop, there's probably generally only one shop in these communities, if that, and buying a prepaid card. You can see them here, power and water card, which they then put in a meter, and that gives them power for a while until their credit runs out. But unfortunately, this power running out is a major issue. Nearly all households in a recent survey, 91% experienced a disconnection over a particular financial year, and almost 3/4 were disconnected more than 10 times in a year. The issue is that most of these people are living on benefits, government benefits, and so they have very little money. And everything is expensive. Living on government benefits is hard anywhere in Australia, but in these remote areas where food is extremely expensive because it has to be imported over such a large distance, housing, power, everything is difficult and expensive in these remote areas. Many of the people in these communities do not speak English well. It's at best a second language for them. Many are illiterate or not very literate, especially the older people, and that makes it very hard for them to read and understand their electricity bills or legal contracts to supply electricity. And because of their culture, they have often little experience with electricity or in fact with money. All of which, not much money, not much understanding of what's going on, means that they often feel disempowered and don't really know what's going on. They feel like people are dictating rules to them, telling them they've got to do this, they've got to do that. They don't quite understand why they're running out of money so fast, but they just know their refrigerator is now warming up and their food has gone off. Community dynamics is an interesting issue. These communities can often have very strong local cultures, and this, for example, means that if one house runs out of electricity, they're expected to supply electricity to the house next door by running an extension cord across, or maybe everyone from the house next door which has run out of electricity will move across, using up even more electricity in your house, which can cause tension and conflict. If they want to get help and talk to someone about what's going on, they might need to drive hundreds of kilometres to go to the nearest office to pay their bills or to talk to an expert. Likewise, if anything breaks, if the diesel generator or the transmission line or the refrigerator breaks, it may take weeks to get a repair person out there, or to, if they can even afford it, or to get any help. And very often the rules are made without consideration of these communities. You might ask, for example, why do these Indigenous communities not have electricity bills like the rest of Australia, which is where you pay after and you get the electricity for 3 months and then get a bill based on how much you use? It turned out that once upon a time, not that many years ago, the Indigenous communities had a chuck-in system where basically the community as a whole would pay for their diesel generator and electricity, and everyone would contribute part of their rent to put it in. But a rule passed probably in Canberra or in the state capital far away said that you can't get government rebates on your electricity bill unless you have an individual bill. So this rule, which was probably a very sensible rule for most of the population, but really had a negative consequence in these remote areas, forced them to a system where they had individual meters in every individual house, which often they didn't understand. It often ran out. So this is a prime example of a rule being made without consideration of these remote communities. So, I mean, clearly renewable energy is the way to go in these places. Solar plus batteries means that you can be standalone, you don't have to supply power, and it's a much more cheap plus environmentally friendly way to do these things. But what you want to do is work with communities to develop these systems. You want to get local involvement and ownership, and rather than just someone outside saying, here's how you're going to do it, here's a contract, sign up, pay your money. They don't have the money very often, and if they don't do it themselves, the way it's billed will probably hurt their community and cause them to continue to run out of money. And also you want to develop some local expertise. If something goes wrong, they can actually fix it themselves. They can help install the whole thing. So a lot of groups are now trying to do this, to actually have organisations putting the solar power in that are actually part owned and part controlled by the Indigenous people, rather than just being something that outsiders come and do, and people are being taught how to develop these things. And you can see some statistics on how many disconnections of power there are, and it's become much less in this particular community since they've had the solar power. So what works is meaningful community engagement, participation and planning, and local employment and local training, and with that solar power could in principle be wonderful for these communities.